Imagine receiving a letter claiming you have just inherited millions of dollars from a long-lost relative overseas. Sounds too good to be true, right? Well, for hundreds of elderly Americans, this dream quickly became a nightmare. Today, we're diving deep into the chilling true story of Okezie Bonaventure Ogbata, the mastermind behind a $6 million international fraud scheme that preyed on the most vulnerable. From intricate lies to heartbroken victims, this case shook the United States and beyond. Margaret Andrews, an 82-year-old widow, lived a quiet, modest life in a small Ohio town. After her husband Harold passed away 5 years ago, Margaret found solace in her garden, the church choir, and her weekly bridge games with friends. She wasn't wealthy, but she had enough savings to live comfortably, thanks to Harold's pension and her disciplined budgeting over the years. Her days were predictable, comforting, and uneventful, until the day the letter arrived. It was a brisk November morning when Margaret shuffled to her mailbox. Among the usual bills and advertisements was a thick envelope with an official-looking letterhead, International Bank of Madrid. The envelope felt heavier than her usual mail, and her curiosity was piqued. Back inside her cozy kitchen, she carefully opened it with trembling hands. The letter began, "Dear Mrs. Andrews, we regret to inform you of the passing of Mr. Charles Fitzgerald, a distant relative of yours who resided in Spain. As his last surviving family member, you are entitled to inherit his estate, which amounts to $4.2 million." Margaret's heart skipped a beat. She couldn't recall any relative named Charles Fitzgerald, but the letter looked so official, complete with legal terminology, seals, and a signature from an alleged director of claims. The possibility of a long-lost relative leaving her millions seemed like a miracle. The letter continued with specific instructions. Before the funds could be released, Margaret was required to pay $2,500 for delivery fees, taxes, and documentation. The payment had to be made quickly to avoid complications with government authorities. Attached was a form asking for her personal information, bank details, and signature to expedite the process. Margaret's emotions were a whirlwind. Could this be true? She was skeptical but also desperate. Her savings were dwindling, and the thought of financial security in her twilight years was intoxicating. Her late husband had always been cautious with money, but Margaret decided this opportunity was too good to pass up. She drove to her bank that very afternoon. The teller hesitated when Margaret requested the wire transfer, but ultimately complied after Margaret insisted. As she sent the money, Margaret whispered a silent prayer, hoping this windfall was real. She envisioned donating to her church, helping her grandchildren with college, and perhaps even taking a long-dreamed trip to Paris. Margaret's anticipation grew over the following days, but instead of receiving her inheritance, she received another letter. This one explained an unforeseen delay and requested an additional $1,000 to resolve bureaucratic hurdles. Margaret was hesitant but didn't want to jeopardize the process, so she sent the money. Weeks turned into months, and Margaret continued receiving requests for more payments, each with new explanations: government clearances, unforeseen taxes, and attorney fees. By the time Margaret realized she had been scammed, she had drained over $15,000 from her savings. Margaret's story was not unique. Across the United States, hundreds of elderly individuals like her were falling victim to the same scheme. The letters were carefully crafted, the fees meticulously calculated to seem plausible but urgent. The mastermind behind the operation, a man named Okezie Bonaventure Ogbata, watched his bank accounts swell as his victims' lives crumbled. Okezie Bonaventure Ogbata was a 36-year-old Nigerian who prided himself on his intelligence and resourcefulness. Born into a modest family, Ogbata grew up in Lagos, where he quickly learned the art of persuasion. As a child, he sold trinkets in the bustling markets, mastering the ability to convince customers to buy items they didn't need. His charm and sharp mind set him apart, but his ambition knew no bounds. In his early 20s, Ogbata was introduced to the world of online scams. It started with small-scale email frauds, requests for urgent help to transfer funds from overseas accounts. The schemes were simple, but they worked. Over time, Ogbata honed his skills, learning how to manipulate emotions and exploit trust. He connected with like-minded individuals who shared his appetite for wealth, and together they devised more sophisticated operations. By the time Ogbata was 30, he had become a central figure in a transnational fraud ring. The inheritance scam was his brainchild. He realized that elderly individuals were particularly susceptible to such schemes. They often lived alone, lacked digital literacy, and were more likely to trust official-looking correspondence. Ogbata's operation was meticulous. Every letter was personalized, referencing common surnames and plausible family connections. The use of foreign banks and legal jargon added an air of legitimacy. Ogbata operated from a comfortable apartment in Lagos, but his network spanned continents. He recruited individuals in the United States to act as intermediaries. These money mules, many of whom were former victims themselves, collected payments and forwarded them to Ogbata or his associates. The scheme was designed to leave no direct trail back to him. For years, Ogbata enjoyed the fruits of his labor. He lived a life of luxury, driving expensive cars, wearing designer clothes, and dining in exclusive restaurants. He justified his actions by telling himself that his victims were strangers who could afford to lose a little money. But in reality, his greed was destroying lives, destroying homes, families losing their life savings, and leaving a lot of people vulnerable. The inheritance scam was a masterpiece of deception. Each step was carefully orchestrated to maximize believability and minimize suspicion. It all began with the letters. Ogbata and his team used online databases to gather the names and addresses of elderly individuals in the United States. The letters were then crafted to appear as though they came from reputable international banks or law firms. The key to the scam's success was personalization. Victims' names were inserted into the letters, and generic surnames like Smith or Johnson were used for the fictional deceased relatives. The letters often included fabricated legal documents, stamped with fake seals and signatures to enhance authenticity. Once a victim responded, the psychological manipulation began. Victims were told that their inheritance was tied up in bureaucratic processes that required immediate payments. The amounts requested were deliberately kept within a range that seemed minimal but significant enough to profit Ogbata's team. The requests were accompanied by warnings about government authorities and legal consequences to discourage victims from seeking help. The money laundering aspect of the operation was equally sophisticated. Payments were funneled through a network of intermediaries. These intermediaries were often victims themselves, who had been duped into believing they were helping a legitimate cause. They would receive funds and forward them to accounts controlled by Ogbata and his associates. The operation was designed to be anonymous and untraceable. Payments were sent to various locations, often in cash or through wire transfers. Ogbata ensured that no single individual had access to the full picture, making it nearly impossible for law enforcement to dismantle the network. The victims of Ogbata's scheme were not just numbers on a spreadsheet. They were real people with hopes, dreams, and vulnerabilities. Most of them were elderly individuals who lived alone and were desperate for financial security. These victims came from all walks of life: retired teachers, factory workers, nurses, and small business owners. Their common thread was a deep-seated trust in the promises made to them. For many, the letters arrived at a time when they needed hope the most. Some were struggling to pay medical bills, others were helping their grandchildren through college, and a few were simply trying to stretch their pensions to cover rising living expenses. The promise of an unexpected inheritance felt like a lifeline. It was a chance to breathe easier, to feel secure, and to perhaps finally fulfill long-deferred dreams. Helen Carter, a 75-year-old retired school teacher from Kansas, was one such victim. She had always been cautious with her money, but the letter she received felt so genuine. It referenced her late husband's family name and included detailed legal explanations. After sending her first payment of $3,000, Helen felt a mix of anxiety and excitement. When she received subsequent requests for more money, she rationalized them as necessary steps to secure her windfall. John Miller, an 80-year-old veteran from Texas, also fell prey to the scam. He had been saving for years to leave a small inheritance for his grandchildren. When he received the letter, he saw it as a blessing. He wired $5,000 from his savings account, believing he was ensuring a brighter future for his family. By the time John realized he had been deceived, he had lost nearly $20,000, money he would never recover. The psychological toll on the victims was immense. Many felt deep shame and chose not to tell their families, fearing judgment or ridicule. The financial losses left them in precarious situations, forcing some to rely on food banks or government assistance. The emotional scars ran deep as trust, a cornerstone of their lives, had been shattered. Unbeknownst to these victims, law enforcement agencies were beginning to take notice. The scale of the operation and the number of victims were too significant to ignore. A complex web of deceit was about to unravel. Law enforcement agencies across the United States began receiving complaints from victims of inheritance scams. The reports were similar. Elderly individuals had been contacted about a supposed inheritance and had sent significant sums of money, only to realize they had been defrauded. The U.S. Postal Inspection Service, USPIS, known for its expertise in tackling mail fraud, took the lead in investigating the growing number of cases. Special Agent Jennifer Hayes was assigned to the case. With years of experience in financial crimes, Hayes recognized the hallmarks of a sophisticated operation. The first step was to analyze the fraudulent letters and trace the payments. Many of the victims had wired money through local bank branches or sent checks to intermediaries. These intermediaries were often difficult to track, as they operated under aliases or were unwitting participants in the scheme. Hayes and her team collaborated with the Department of Justice's Consumer Protection Branch, Homeland Security Investigations, HSI, and international law enforcement agencies. The operation's transnational nature complicated matters, but it also highlighted the need for global cooperation. Investigators in Portugal uncovered crucial evidence linking the fraudulent letters to a network of individuals operating in Nigeria and Spain. A breakthrough came when an intermediary in Florida, who had been collecting funds for the scammers, was caught. He was brought in for questioning, and after a prolonged explanation of how they operate all over the globe, he agreed to cooperate with authorities. The intermediary provided information about the individuals who had recruited them and the methods used to launder the money. This testimony led investigators to a key figure in the operation, Okezie Bonaventure Ogbata. Ogbata's name had surfaced multiple times during the investigation, but solid evidence was needed to build a case against him. Law enforcement agents monitored his online activities, intercepted communications, and traced financial transactions. The evidence painted a clear picture of Ogbata's role as the mastermind behind the inheritance scam. After months of meticulous investigation, authorities were ready to act. On a sunny morning in Lagos, Nigerian law enforcement, working in coordination with U.S. and Portuguese agencies, raided Ogbata's apartment. Inside, they found stacks of forged documents, computers filled with victim information, and evidence of financial transactions linked to the scam. Ogbata was arrested and extradited to the United States to face charges. The trial, held in the U.S. District Court for the Southern District of Florida, attracted significant media attention. Prosecutors presented a compelling case, detailing how Ogbata and his co-conspirators had defrauded over 400 victims, amassing more than $6 million in illicit gains. The victims' testimonies were heart-wrenching. Many described the emotional and financial devastation caused by the scam. Margaret Andrews, who had lost her life savings, spoke about the shame and regret she felt. Her story, like those of so many others, underscored the human cost of Ogbata's greed. On January 15th, Okezie Bonaventure Ogbata pleaded guilty to conspiracy to commit mail and wire fraud. His sentencing, scheduled for April 14th, marked the end of a long journey for the victims and investigators. Ogbata faced a maximum penalty of 20 years in prison, a fitting punishment for the lives he had ruined. The case served as a stark reminder of the importance of vigilance in the face of fraud. Public awareness campaigns were launched to educate individuals about common scams and how to avoid them. Law enforcement agencies emphasized the need for international collaboration to combat transnational crime. For the victims, the road to recovery was long. Some found solace in support groups, where they shared their experiences and rebuilt their lives. Others took comfort in the knowledge that justice had been served. Margaret Andrews returned to her church choir, finding peace in the music and the community that had supported her through her ordeal. While the scars of the scam would never fully heal, the case of Okezie Bonaventure Ogbata was a testament to the resilience of those who had been wronged and the relentless pursuit of justice by those who sought to protect them. Thank you for listening to True Crime Pulse. Share your thoughts on the story, and like and subscribe to the channel. Until the next episode when we bring you more crime stories, stay vigilant.